the word Negro.
Negro! Negro!
Negroes. Negro.
You've heard it before, maybe in old speeches, movies, or even as a joke online today. But have you ever stopped to ask, where did this word come from? How did it start? And how did a word once used so openly, even proudly, become something most people now avoid? The term Negro is not originally American. It's Spanish and Portuguese, derived from the Latin word niger, which simply means black. In the 15th century, when European explorers began traveling along the western coast of Africa, they used this word to describe the people they encountered, gente negra, or black people. At first, it wasn't an insult. It was a description, color-based, like white or brown, but over time, as Europe's ambitions grew and slavery became a business, that simple label took on a new, darker meaning. By the early 1500s, Portuguese traders were transporting enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. They recorded them in ship logs as Negros. From those ships, the word crossed oceans to the Caribbean, to South America, and finally to the shores of what would become the United States. The word traveled with change. It was written on documents, shouted in markets, printed on slave auction posters, and slowly Negro became more than a label. It became a category of humanity, a system. By the 1600s, when enslaved Africans began arriving in British colonies like Virginia, the word Negro was already common. Colonial records used it to define who was property and who was not. Laws began to say, Negroes shall serve for life, distinguishing them from white indentured servants who eventually gained freedom. And that's when the word stopped being neutral. It wasn't just a description anymore. It became a legal identity. In other words, being a Negro wasn't about skin color anymore. It was about status. It meant you could be bought, sold, or punished differently under the law. By the 1700s, the word was cemented into the very fabric of American law, culture, and religion. Ministers preached about Negro souls, slave owners wrote letters about obedient Negroes, and even the early U.S. Census used the word as an official category. The word wasn't born hateful, but it became a tool shaped by centuries of power, profit, and hierarchy. So the next time you hear the word Negro in an old clip or comedy sketch, remember, it didn't just come from thin air. It came from a time when people were being defined by skin color, traded as property, and stripped of names and nations. The word started as a label, but ended up as a brand of ownership. There was a time when the word Negro wasn't whispered, censored, or seen as an insult. It was official. It was printed on government papers, spoken in Congress, and proudly carried by leaders who demanded equality. After slavery ended in 1865, a new America was trying to define what freedom meant. But for millions of newly freed Africans, that freedom came with the question, who are we now? The government still called them Negroes. The newspapers said it. Churches, schools, and universities used it. And soon it became the standard identity for an entire people. During the early 20th century, the word Negro even began to represent pride and progress. The Harlem Renaissance gave birth to a new self-image, educated, artistic, unapologetically black. Writers like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and Claude McKay used the word Negro proudly as a sign of rebirth. Langston Hughes once wrote, "I am a Negro and beautiful." That line carried a message. We exist, we create, we matter. By the 1950s and 60s, Negro was still deeply woven into American life. Martin Luther King Jr. used it often in his speeches.
The fact that the Negro.
Rosa Parks used it. Malcolm X used it.
Negro.
Even major organizations like the NAACP still had colored people in their names. The word symbolized unity, a shared struggle, and respectability within a segregated nation. But as time moved forward, the meaning began to change. Younger generations, especially those on the front lines of the civil rights movement, began to question everything, the laws, the system, and even the language that described them. To them, Negro sounded like a word chosen by white society, a word that came from slavery, not from freedom. The old leaders saw it as polite, dignified, even necessary to be heard in white America. The new ones rejected that. They didn't want politeness, they wanted power, and so they began saying black. In 1966, Stokely Carmichael, one of the key voices of the Black Power movement, declared something that echoed across the country. We are not Negroes, we are black people. That moment changed everything. Negro began to fade. The press stopped using it. Schools and universities quietly replaced it. By the early 1970s, it was a word from another era, one that carried too much pain, too much history, and too much misunderstanding. A single word that once united millions had become a reminder of who named them in the first place. For over 4 centuries, it evolved from a label of property to a symbol of progress, and finally, a word too heavy to carry. But even when a word dies, its shadow doesn't disappear. It lingers in memories, in old recordings, in the way people still react when they hear it. And that shadow is what we face next. By the late 1960s, America wasn't just changing laws, it was changing language. The civil rights movement had cracked open a century of silence, and words that once felt ordinary began to sting. Negro, once printed in textbooks and census records, began to sound like a relic of an unequal past. Language reflects power, and for the first time, Black Americans were taking control of both. In 1965, the U.S. government still used Negro on official forms. The Census Bureau, military, and even the media clung to it. But outside those offices, something new was rising, identity on their own terms. Young activists were burning the old vocabulary. To them, Negro wasn't neutral. It was colonial. It was the name the slave owner used, the name printed on slave manifests, and that made it unbearable. Stokely Carmichael and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee were among the first to reject it publicly. They began using Black and Afro-American, and their defiance caught fire across the country. Black students, writers, and musicians joined in. James Brown screamed it from the stage. Say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud. That one line in 1968 buried the word Negro more effectively than any law ever could. By 1970, major newspapers like the New York Times began phasing it out. TV anchors followed. Universities updated their courses. Even the government started to shift, slowly, cautiously. In the 1970 census, Negro was still listed, but a new line appeared beside it, Black or African American. That was the beginning of the end. By the 1980s, Negro had virtually vanished from modern language, except in older institutions and historical texts. Civil rights leaders and black scholars urged its retirement, not from shame, but from progress. The word had served its time, and its time had passed. Malcolm X, years earlier, had already predicted this transformation. He once said,
"And every time you look at yourself, be you black, brown, red, or yellow, a so-called Negro, you represent a person who poses such a serious problem for America because you're not one. Once you face this as a fact, then you can start plotting a course that will make you appear intelligent instead of unintelligent."
For a generation raised on resistance, that line felt like truth. So the word that once represented pride now felt like surrender. Even the U.S. government officially abandoned it in the late 1990s, when most forms switched to Black or African American as the accepted identifier. And by the 2000 census, Negro existed only as an optional term, kept only for elderly citizens who still preferred it. By 2013, the word was officially removed from the federal lexicon altogether. The U.S. Department of Labor, Census Bureau, and other agencies formally banned it. And so, after more than 400 years, a single word, born from colonial tongues, carried through slavery, used in freedom, and buried in pride, was finally laid to rest. Yet, even now, it lingers in jokes and old recordings in the uneasy laughter when someone quotes a line from a movie or song. Comedy skits from the 2000s to today still dance around it, not from malice but from the tension it carries. From Chappelle's show to modern YouTube parodies, the word appears as satire, a reminder that America still doesn't fully know how to talk about race without discomfort. That's the legacy of Negro, a word that refused to die quietly. Its history tells us something deeper, that progress isn't just about laws or rights. It's about redefining the very words that built the walls. Even after Negro faded from official language, it didn't vanish from the public ear. It echoed through old recordings, through movies, through jokes that tested boundaries. Language doesn't die the day it's banned. It lingers in culture, where people try to make sense of what they once feared to say. In the 1970s and 80s, comedians like Richard Pryor and Eddie Murphy started using the word not to insult, but to expose how absurd racism had been. Pryor's raw honesty forced audiences to laugh and then flinch. He later admitted that after visiting Africa, he stopped using racial words altogether. "I saw people who looked like me, and I realized I'd been calling myself something I'm not." That was the turning point. The word became a mirror. That was the turning point. The word became a mirror. In music, old blues tracks, soul lyrics, and even early hip-hop samples carried it as a reference to history, not identity. The laughter it created was uneasy, the kind that reveals truth rather than hides it. But beneath the humor lay a serious question. Why does this word still have power? Maybe because words born from pain always do. In modern America, Negro is nearly extinct in speech. You'll find it only in archives, documentaries, or the titles of civil rights organizations that chose to preserve their original names, like the NAACP. You might hear it slip through the lips of an elder, not with hate, but with habit. For them, it was once the most respectful word available, before the world changed its tongue. And yet, every time it reappears, in a song lyric, a movie line, or a viral clip, it sparks debate. Younger generations call it outdated, even offensive. Older ones see it as history. Both are right. Because the story of Negro is not just about language, It's about transformation. It's about how a community evolved from being named to naming themselves. From Negro to Black to African American, every word marks a chapter in the long fight for dignity. In 2010, when the U.S. Census included Negro one last time, it sparked national conversation. Many asked, why keep a word that no one uses? But thousands of older Black Americans still checked that box. Not out of denial, out of memory. For them, it was a word that once meant hope. Today, the term survives only as history, in museums, in archives, in the pages of books that dare not rewrite the past. And maybe that's where it belongs, as a reminder, not a label. Because every word has a life. And when a word like Negro finally dies, what replaces it tells us who we've become. After 2011, the word Negro had become little more than a relic of the past. It still appeared in old archives, census forms, and historical books, but in daily life it was gone. The younger generations didn't grow up hearing it seriously. If it showed up at all, it was in old movies, or as part of a joke, often in comedy or satire where its outdatedness itself became the punchline. No one used it in normal conversation anymore. Not in schools, not in workplaces, not in public life. The word that once traveled across continents, languages, and centuries had finally settled into history. And maybe that's where it belongs, as a reminder of how words can shape people, and how people, in return, can outgrow words. Today it survives only as a topic of study, a reference point in documentaries, or a symbol of a long linguistic and cultural journey. What was once a neutral term, then a mark of division, now stands as a quiet lesson that even the smallest word can carry the heaviest weight.